Welcome to another video. In this series, I give you some insights on how the Vault-Maxi works, the involved parts, and also some deep dives into the code. Because I believe that it is important to understand what such a tool does and how it is doing it before you start using it with any significant amount of money. Today, let's look into the code itself and what's going on in there. We start off with a bit of graphics and overview what it does, and then we will dive into the code. So let's get right in. The code itself, or the Vault-Maxi itself, if you look at it from a high level, it's pretty basic. It's started by the trigger from the AWS. The Lambda function is triggered every 15 minutes. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, watch the architecture video before that. There you see all the trigger and what's going on outside of the code and the structure. So we get started by the trigger. Then we have some main Vault logic or Vault-Maxi logic. We'll dive into that soon. And from this logic, either it behaves whatever fine and everything is good, then we're finished and wait for the next trigger, or we can get out. Some error happens, anything goes bad, then we have a bit of a cooldown period. We check if we still have time in this execution, because every Lambda execution has a timeout of 15 minutes. So after 15 minutes, it gets cut. And if we still have time, we basically try again. So we have kind of a main loop where we try to do our logic steps. If it fails, we try again. If we run out of time, we're finished, and the next trigger will do that. So let's look into this main logic. As you see, this is a bit more, but not too complex. So let's start in. I colored the stuff that's actually doing something on the chain. So if any action that's happening is happening in one of those colored areas, we have overall basically 3 areas. We have first the sanity checks and the checks itself, or what's happening. Is everything fine? If the vault fine and everything? Then we have the area where we say there are actions that need to be done to have a safe environment, or where we must do something to prevent liquidation. Not that we say prevent it in the next minute, but to make sure that no liquidation is happening. So clean up after an error, removing exposure, decreasing the exposure. And then if that all is clear and we say, okay, we are safe, there is no liquidation risk or anything, we are fine, then there are actions that can be done where we say we might want to do something, like reinvest or increase. So go a bit into the stuff. Let's make it a bit bigger so you can actually read it. So if we go in, we start this main logic from the loop that we had there. Let's move that. So we start in. First, we check, is this just a check setup execution? So with Vault-Maxi, you can trigger it with an event where you tell him, please just check my setup. Don't do anything, just check it if everything is fine. Then you get a notification in Telegram that says, okay, from your parameters, I think you want to monitor this address, this vault, those parameters, that is set, that's what I read from your settings. And then you can check, is this fine? Are all my parameters set in a way as I want it? Or is the result of the parameters what I want? So it does nothing else there. If it's a check setup call, it runs and reports this check setup and then exits, nothing else done. If we're not in a check setup, we do some sanity and validity checks where we say, okay, is this wallet fine? Do we have the correct key or seed for this address? Is this vault, does this vault even exist? Is this address the owner of this vault? Are the parameters fine? Maybe we do some sanity checks and adaptions. If the min collateral ratio is below the loan scheme ratio, or that the max collateral ratio is more than 2% above the min collateral ratio, that we have a range that we can work with. Also checks like, do we even have the exposure needed to save the vault? That's the safety level, because it doesn't help if Vault-Maxi is running, but there is no liquidity mining exposure in this pair and nothing can be done. Or if you even put in a wrong pair, anything like that is checked here. If there's something completely wrong, we report and exit. If something might be possible, that we say it's fine, we can adapt it, and it's fine, and we continue. So now, after this line up here, from here on, we're basically in a state where we say, okay, the parameters that we have, the current state that we have it, are in a state where we can execute the stuff. We have a vault, we have an address, we have valid parameters, we have something that's meaningful. So let's check what we need to do to have a safe vault, to save the vault. First, was there some problem with a previous execution? Because every 15 minutes you have the execution. It could be that there was a timeout, that there was an error, that there was anything. So let's check the previous state. Either there's a pending transaction and we need to wait for this transaction to be done, to be in the chain, or we need to clean up after an error, then we clean up. So we take cleanup means take all the assets that are handled by the Vault-Maxi and pay back the loans from the vault. So clean up the address and make it as safe as possible. After the cleanup, or if nothing needs to be done, we have a few checks that trigger some steps. First is our vault frozen, because if the vault is frozen, we need to remove exposure completely. That's a safety measure. Usually it's not necessary, but you don't know, because when the vault is frozen, there is no oracle price on that loan and anything. And it could be because, yes, when the vault is frozen because of one asset, this asset, the vault gets unfrozen, and the next oracle price will take effect 1 hour later for this price that was frozen for this asset. But in the case of you have a D-token loan and this D-token gets frozen, this D-token is fine, but DFI runs normally, and if DFI drops massively while the vault is frozen, it could be that the moment you get out of the frozen state, you are already below collateral ratio, because the old value of the D-token is still fine, but the DFI value moved. That's why safety measure, if the vault is frozen, remove exposure, otherwise we are flying blind. So remove exposure, and once we are back in a valid state, we can increase the exposure again. Same with the interest rate. Since we have or will have dynamic DUSD interest rates, we added the case to say, okay, if the interest rate on the USD is too high, remove the exposure. It's currently not profitable to do the liquidity mining to run the Vault-Maxi. I guess it won't really happen, or if it happens for a few minutes, but safety's sake, if the interest rate is too high, you can be safe. As soon as this happens, the exposure is removed. Or because of some parameter setting, when you set the parameter, the max collateral ratio to -1, that means you want to remove the exposure. So it's do I want to remove the exposure? Yes, then exposure is removed, and we're done. We are basically out. If that's not the case, if we don't want or need to remove the exposure, we come to the last check regarding safety, where we say, okay, is our current ratio that we use, which is the minimum of the current and the next ratio, is it below our minimum ratio? If yes, we need to do something. We need to decrease the exposure so that we are in the middle of the ratio of the range again. And again, if we need to do something, if we need to decrease, we exit. So after that, we are now safe. There is no need to do anything to prevent liquidation. We are fine. So let's move on. Nothing happened. This exit, next execution, we can check stuff if we want to do something to benefit from the whole thing. First thing is, let's check if we can reinvest. If there is some funds on the address that we can reinvest. If we get them, do they reinvest? Here we don't exit right away, because here we have safety measures where we say, okay, we did something and just exit. It's a bit of in the remove exposure, we don't want to do anything else, but in the decrease exposure, it's, we could do that, but right now we don't, more as historical reasons. If check and we do reinvest is done, we check, do we have time left? So either we did nothing or there's still time left in this execution. then we check and increase the exposure. That's done after reinvest, because otherwise you increase exposure, then you see, there's something to reinvest, which triggers another increasing exposure. So we said first reinvest, then check for the increased exposure. And afterwards, if there's still time left, we have this additional stablecoin arbitrage, which is basically not related to the Vault and the collateral ratio. It's just fits into the whole thing, because you can take it out of the collateral and do stuff. It's in there. That's also why it's a different color. It's just an additional utility. And if there's time left, we do that. And after that, basically everything is done, and we just collect what we did, report the result to Telegram, that there was something, if something changed, we have this something changed and all, report the results, and then exit. So basically that's the rough idea of what it does. And now with that, let's jump into the code. So here we have the code. On the left again, diagram, what's happening. On the right, we have the code. I use Visual Studio Code. I increased the size, or the font size. I hope you can read it. Otherwise, you need to check it in the repository yourself and just follow what I say. On the left side, you see generally the structure of the code, what we have there. We have on the one hand a bit of our stuff with the cloud templates and everything, and we have the source folders. In the source folders, we have the main parts, main source files that include the Lambda functions, the Vault-Maxi and the liquidity mining reinvest. And then we have the programs where we have the stuff that's actually executed, or that's where the real logic is. And then we have some utils. In these utils, we have helpers for Telegram, for the wallet setup, for the store access of AWS and stuff like that. Today, we just have the overall structure. So we basically just look into this Vault-Maxi file, where this structure is handled, where we have that. And in upcoming videos, we might look into the details of how the remove exposure happens, how the decrease in exposure happens, and so on. So let's look into that. We have here the Vault-Maxi file. It's 280 lines, not that big. Let's dive in. First, imports. Then we have some data structures. The overall code is, well, maybe it's not too clean, but it is what it is. So don't judge. If you go in, you see here, this is this main function. This is basically the function that is executed by the Lambda. When you look into the Lambda in AWS, you see that there you can tell the Lambda what should be executed usually, and here the handler.main. So this is our main function in the handler. This is executed, and as you see, you get in an event. We call this the Maxi event, and you have the context from outside where AWS tells you stuff like get my remaining time in milliseconds, so that I know how long it will. I still have time until the Lambda gets into a timeout. As you see in here, we have nothing else in this but the main function. So this is what's happening. And again, here you have the while. So this is our main loop that we talked about before, where the main stuff happens. And as soon as I have time, I do something. So I go in. First I say, okay, do I have a custom ocean? If I have a custom ocean, I use that in the first execution. What we will see in a case of an error, we change that. Then I go in, I fetch the settings from the store and everything. And as you see, this is all already in the while. So within this loop. And the main idea is that each execution in the loop is as clean or as fresh as possible. So if there's some error, if there's an error because the store didn't work or anything, if there's any error in there, we start fresh, get the fresh settings, get the fresh store, and run again. Exactly. Then we get this event, what you get from outside, and check if we want to. This event is triggered manually and you want to override settings. That's pretty handy in AWS. Like this check setup call, you can also put in override settings where you define a max collateral ratio, a min collateral ratio, or something for just this call, which is, for example, if you want to reduce or remove the exposure at all, you can just execute it once with the max collateral ratio -1. We don't go into details right now. Here you have the log ID, the Telegram setup, if it should skip, which is basically for the command center to be able to skip it one execution. And then we come to the interesting part, to the main part, where we have this try, and you see we have this try catch, 175 lines of code, which is our main logic now. And here we are in this any error happens. If anything goes wrong in there, we get an exception. We have to, okay, something went wrong. We check what it is, because in case of an ocean timeout, because this reply from the ocean can't be passed, it's a syntax error in the passing, or we have just a timeout from the whale client, then we just give a different message so that you see in the Telegram, you see there was a timeout, and you don't see some unexpected error happens, because if there's a timeout, you might react differently than some unexpected error. As I said, if any problem happens, we fall back to the, if we have a custom ocean, we fall back to the default ocean, so the standard ocean API, in case this custom ocean API has a problem. And then, since any error happened, we update our store state to the error state. If we have a program already and there's a pending transaction for whatever reason, we keep that so that next cleanup, as we have here this pending transaction, that they know that there's a pending transaction. Otherwise, it might happen that next execution, it runs, it tries again to do something, but there is still a pending transaction, and so we have a conflict and we have an error again. We want to prevent that. So we save that, and then we do a delay, so our cooldown, which is 1 minute in the first place, and then we increase the cooldown, just because otherwise, if, for example, ocean is down, as soon as it starts, it gets an error from the ocean because there's some pass error probably. You get an error, you get an error message in your Telegram, it waits for a minute later it does that again 15 times because it's 15 minutes till the overall timeout happens. Could be pretty annoying if you get 15 messages just because ocean is down, and it will be fine within in a half an hour or something. So we increase the cooldown. If the error is serious and persisting, do not spam the Telegram. So it's 1 minute, next cooldown is 2 minutes, then it's 3 minutes until we run out of time. So it's a bit less time. In the beginning it's faster, and then it delay, and after that it will try again. So let's go to the actual execution of stuff. So put in. So we get our Vault-Maxi program. That's what I said. That's in here. Which does the actual execution. So we initialize that with our wallet setup, where we have the seed and everything from the store in there. It initializes the program, and then we have already the first thing. We are basically here. Is it a check setup call? So did we get an event check setup? If yes, do and report the check, and then return, get out of here. Report check setup and exit. Good. Next step, so we don't look into that now. Today is, as I said, just the overview, maybe in a different video. Then if we are not in a check setup, we actually want to do something. So let's get the vault, let's get the pool that we want to do, and let's get the balances and do the checks. This is now our sanity checks. This checks internally, on the one hand, check if there are some showstoppers, some really blockers where we say we can't do anything. So if this is not okay, if they are not fine, report and exit. Report happens in there, exit is here, so we don't continue anything. Otherwise, we know we are now in a state, as I said here, we are in a state, we have a pool, we have valid vault, valid balances and everything. So let's move on. First, we have to the vault, which is active, we check the state. So here we are now in this check and handle previous state. It's basically this state information from the settings. If the state is not idle, yeah, log what's happening, check, is the state waiting for a transaction? If yes, wait for it, see if we get it. If this wait is an error because it's not there, it's not coming or anything, then we go to the error, we switch to error, otherwise we are in idle. We just need to get the updated data from the chain, because now something could have changed because of this transaction, so we need to update that and move on. In the case of an error, so either this happens to be an error or we were in an error in the first place, we do the cleanup. Nothing fancy. After the cleanup, again, we get our data, or we sync our data, because something happened probably in the cleanup, so we want up-to-date data. Now report that there was the cleanup fine, we did successfully clean up after stuff, or there was an error, please check yourself, update the state, and now we have this, do we still have time? We already have here, do we still have time? Otherwise we move out, so not to run into an error. Usually cleanup doesn't take that long, so we should have time and move on. Next step, are we frozen? If the vault is frozen, we remove exposure and exit, as we said here. Nothing more to add. If the vault is not frozen, let's do some calculations. We have this interest rate now. So if our main collateral is DFI, because in the case of main collateral DFI, we always have a DUSD loan, either only DUSD or both. If the main collateral is DUSD, the DUSD interest rate doesn't matter for us, so we don't care. So only if it's DFI. Now we go in, check what's our pool APR, what's our D token interest rate with the loan scheme and the DUSD interest rate. If it's too high, warn and set the max collateral ratio to -1. So to tell it from now on, remove exposure and don't do any other exposure. Now we go into the actual work, basically, because here we say, okay, what's our old ratio, what's our next ratio? The used ratio is the minimum between the actual ratio and the next ratio, and let's some logging that we know where we start. First thing, do we want to remove exposure? Is the max collateral ratio less or equal to 0? Means we want to remove exposure. If we have exposure and we want to remove exposure and we have exposure, execute the program.remove exposure, then update the stuff that we have in the reports afterwards, the new values, and we are done. I mean, exit, in reality, exit is report and exit, but never mind. So second, we don't want to remove exposure. Let's see if we need to reduce exposure. So if we have exposure, so if there is any loan and our collateral ratio is below the minimum collateral ratio, so that's basically this question. If this is the case, we execute decrease exposure. In there, it calculates where do we increase it and or what's the target and what to do. Afterwards, something changed, so we get the data again, and we are done. We jump out of the whole thing. Last case, so now we are out of this. Do we need to do something to save or to be on the safe side? So we are now in this area. This is one else block now, where we could do multiple stuff. First, check and do reinvest, as we have here. Gets the stuff, does it, knows if something changed. If exposure changed, again, get the updated data from the chain. Now, do we still have time? If the remaining time is more than what we expect to need for per one action, it's roughly, we set it to 5 minutes. do we have still time? Check again what's now the collateral use collateral ratio, because it could have changed here. If our total value is below, collateral value is below $10, we have this check that we don't do anything, because that's too small of an amount that it makes sense to do all these executions, to do the transactions and everything. And sometimes there could be errors in the interest rates and everything if you have such a small vault. So don't be confused. If you have a vault below $10, it just won't do anything. If we have enough collateral there, and either our use collateral ratio is less than 0, so it's -1, means there is no exposure at all, no vault at all, or second case, we are bigger than our setting, so we want to increase exposure. Yeah, pretty straightforward. As with the decrease program, increase exposure, running, understands if something happened, and executes the vault or updates the data again from the chain. Again, we're out here, check, do we have still time left? Now we're in this case. Do we have time left? And is the stablecoin arbitrage batch size greater than 0? So the settings, from the settings, do we even want to do that? Yes, we want to do that. We have still time. We go in, we check what's our free collateral in this vault. What's the wanted batch size? If the free collateral is below the wanted batch size, so we can't use the whole thing, we warn the user that the available collateral is below and reduce the batch size to the available collateral and run with that. And then we have okay, do we have a batch size? Can we do something? Yes, check into the stable arb. In there, it checks the pools, if there is a arbitrage opportunity, and if yes, executes that. If something changed, we have the exposure changed, and we update the vault and balances that we have the updated data. So we do that, and then we're done. Only thing that's left is, out of this, we update the state, that is everything fine. So we have an idle state, calculus new safety level, and then we have a lot of reporting message that is basically just, did I do something or successfully or with problems, with changes, without changes, what's your current target range, what's your current safety level, which you get into your log channel. Every 15 minutes you get the value, one log that we say, okay, we are done, that's our safety level, and we're out. And that's it. That's all that is to the overall structure. 30-minute video, that's okay, we can work with that. I hope this helped. I hope it's a bit understandable. If there's any question left, leave a comment. Yes, I will probably do a German version, so you don't need to ask for that. Beside that, yeah, like the video if you like it, and see you in the next, where we might do a deeper dive into the functions.